Well, welcome to part 4 of Things That Will Get You Canceled and Why They Matter, this unusual Sunday school class that we're continuing with. And I'm going to jump right in here and give you the title of today's class, which is Obnoxiously Long, and I'm Not Sorry. The title this morning, The Thing That Will Get You Canceled, but which we must press forward in doing nonetheless, is Chuckling at Evolutionists and patting them on the head while saying, "That's nice, dear." That is the title of the class this morning. And so today, we're going to be talking about evolutionary naturalism, and why it's important that we make fun of it and laugh at it. And so, let's get into it. You've probably noticed this before about yourself. You've probably noticed this about people around you, and that's that people are storytellers. We're essentially a storytelling people. Why? Well, because we're made in the image of what you could say is the arch storyteller of God himself. God, when he tells stories, they become history. Like, that is what's happening. God is breathing out this creation. He says, let there be this character arc, and then there is that character arc in history. That's what history actually is. That's one way of thinking about it. And so people were made in the image of God, and what that means is that we can't help but tell stories, right? We can't help but whether we're talking about little slices of our own lives or even the whole story of reality, about turning that into some kind of story in which we're recognizing characters and story arcs. We often do this when we're explaining given situations in our life, where we'll say, well, and then this happened, and then, of course, I lost my keys, and let me tell you how whatever force of the universe, whether you're a Christian or you're an atheist, brought you through the long wilds of providence to find your keys again in the least likely place. We just tell stories. And people have been doing this about nearly every aspect of human existence, but it's also true if you zoom out to this question of ultimate reality, We try to place ourselves in the narrative. We try to explain where everything came from, where everything is going to. This is all theology, creation, eschatology. Atheists do it, Christians do it, Buddhists do it. We all do it. And what you believe about the true nature of reality will, of course, determine what kind of story you try to tell about the nature of reality that you find yourself in. Your own life, your sense data, your experiences, your thoughts. And we're probably all aware of this, but there's a story that's come to dominate the cultural landscape right now in the world of modernity. And it's a story in which, if you really boil things down, the only actors on the stage are essentially various atoms bumping into each other in random, unguided, and meaningless ways. And in a plot twist that requires the most astonishing suspension of disbelief since John McClane surfed on a fighter jet after jumping off an overpass in Die Hard 4, which, if you haven't seen it, I don't recommend spending your time in that way. In a plot twist that requires a suspension of disbelief even greater than that, for no real reason whatsoever, all of those atoms bumping into each other eventually organize themselves into planets and stars and frogs and giraffes and even into evolutionary biologists. So we're taking what might seem like a left turn this morning in the series, because we've essentially been talking about anthropology so far. Areas of Christian anthropology, a Christian doctrine of man, Christian doctrine of what is a person, what is a man, what is a woman, how are they to relate to each other, what kind of hierarchies has the Lord built into the world that he made. We're essentially going from that, and then it might feel jarring to say all of a sudden, now we're going to talk about evolutionary naturalism. Seems like a pretty disjunctive move between those two things. But actually, I hope you'll see that this is a very logical continuation of the ideas that we've been working through, because essentially, what we're doing in answering and looking at this question of origins is we're answering the question of why there even is an ought at all, why there even is a way that things should be. Right? When people butt up against this idea that they are not gods, which is really why you'll get canceled for telling people how they ought to be a man, or how they ought to be a woman, or how they ought to interact with marriage, or how they ought to interact with childbearing. All of those oughts, those moral oughts where they ought to be one way rather than another way, when you tell somebody, no, you cannot actually be a crocodile, a puppy, or a woman, you are a boy. You're a man. You're a male. And this is what it means to be a male. Or you're a female that God created in his image. And here's what it means to be a female. When people run into limitations and duties that are moral in nature, they respond in rebellion. Why? Because fundamentally, human rebellion is idolatry. It's the worship of other gods, where we say, we don't want your moral oughts. We don't want your law, God. We want the law of this other God, whom we think is going to be better for us. Or we want to be gods ourselves. And so, of course, gods aren't limited by external factors. You can't tell me what to do with my person. You can't define my anthropology. When we talk about this issue of origins, and particularly evolutionary naturalism, we're getting underneath a lot of what's driving the kind of moral relativism and anthropological insanity that would make a culture like ours reject any kind of ought with respect to masculinity, femininity, marriage, childbearing, home, life, etc. Anything that sounds anything like there is a right way and a wrong way to be a man, a woman, to order a home, to map your maleness or femaleness onto the world. And that something is evolutionary thinking. That's what's underneath a lot of this. Or at least that is the story that we're telling in many cases to justify our rebellion. Whoa. I thought that was leaking, or that a child had fallen in behind me into the baptismal, for those of you listening online. You may remember I think it was one of the 3 or 4 horsemen is what they called them of the new atheism, was Daniel Dennett. And he popularized this phrase that when he called Darwin's theory was essentially a universal acid that would inevitably dissolve and corrode away the foundations of all religious thinking and belief. What he was saying is that once you establish that this story of how biological life came to be, or at least came to be in its present state, contra the story that all of these religious ideologies are telling, well, you've just shown them, you just falsified them. So it's just a universal acid. It's going to eat away everything, corrode it down to the bottom, down to the foundations. And in some ways, culturally, he hasn't been wrong. I think fundamentally he's wrong. I think that story will ultimately lose because it's not true and because it's absurd. But he's been at least correct in his cultural assessment in the near term that evolutionary thinking has functioned in many ways as an acid that has eaten away at the foundations of faith for many individual people. Discovering this story that academia is telling, that everybody from kindergarten through the higher education world in the modern West especially is telling. Many students have bought it, and then they've concluded, well, everything that they should conclude. Well, if this is true, then there's no meaning, there's no beauty, there's no purpose, there's no God. We're just highly evolved primates, you and me, baby, ain't nothing but mammals kind of thinking. And so he wasn't necessarily wrong about the cultural implications of at least adopting this story, regardless of whether it's true or not. And this is one of the reasons that it's important for us as Christians to be prepared to not only not absorb this story and tell it as if it's true, even to try and harmonize it with our faith somehow, which you can do some gymnastics to attempt to do that. But they are gymnastics, no matter how how many degrees you have and how many articles BioLogos writes, you're still going to be doing gymnastics to try and adopt this sort of belief. It's important that we not only not adopt it, but that we actually laugh at it, that we actually mock it, we actually see it for how a priori absurd it is. You've probably heard the fable, or I can't remember if it's a fable or some kind of whatever, it's a fairy tale of the emperor with no clothes, where the emperor was taken in by these charlatans who convinced him that they were weaving him garments, which he paid quite a bit for, that only really intelligent people could see. And so they brought it out and they put it on him, and he was like, oh no, I can't see it. And he thought, well, I don't want to be considered foolish, so I will pretend like I can see it. And then he went on a parade through the whole city, and of course all of the people knew this special clothes that these people have woven for the emperor. Only stupid people can't see it. And so everybody around is like, oh, what beautiful clothes. I really like the way the cravat turns there, and the colors are magnificent. They're all pretending to see what you and I know, obviously, are clothes that don't exist, until, I think the story goes, a little child in the crowd looks at it and he's like, Emperor's naked. He's naked, guys. I was told that was the no-no zone. I wasn't supposed to show that in public. But the emperor seems to be, and he was laughing at it, and that popped the bubble, the illusion, and the emperor realized that he'd been taken in. And, I think this is the sort of thing that's been happening for the last at least 40 years, probably more like 60 years in academia with respect to evolutionary naturalism, where it's become increasingly clear that the theory essentially doesn't work. And so they've been attempting to pile more and more ad hoc, fanciful, exotic theories on top of exotic theories. Now we're talking about multiverse scenarios, which are by definition almost untestable, where we're just putting theoretical math together to try and explain some reality just to justify this theory, because we know that it doesn't work based on the observations that we can undertake, based on almost all of the evidence that we can compile. But nothing will get you canceled in the vaunted halls of academia quite like questioning this evolutionary story. It will get you fired, unpublished, canceled, and laughed out of the room. It will get you charged, convicted, and exiled for the crime of wrongthink. If you, for example, spend 15 years of your life studying evolutionary naturalism or biological evolution and get 3 or 4 PhDs and publish 15 academic papers in peer-reviewed journals, and then begin to question the narrative, it doesn't matter what you've done in the past. You will be laughed out of the room and silenced very quickly. This has characterized the intellectual discourse around this issue for quite some time. But what I want you to see is that the emperor of evolutionary naturalism, for all of the flamboyant finery he boasts, is actually stark naked, and so we should laugh at him. So I'm going to give you a few reasons, show my work here a little bit, of why this is the case. And then we're going to talk about what we ought to do about it as Christians other than laugh. But we should begin by laughing. So we're going to walk through some obvious problems with this evolutionary story that is told all around the world, from kindergarten to higher ed. Explains, you can read almost any aspect of culture, you'll find evolutionary thinking there. I even think about guys like Jordan Peterson, who actually ends up saying quite a few true things about the world because he's willing to commit wrongthink, so he'll say things about masculinity and femininity, for example, and in communism or in different political idiocies in the world. He'll look at them and he'll say, well, obviously that's stupid. And he'll say the right thing, but often, even a guy like that will then justify his work based on this evolutionary story, and he'll start appealing to lobsters for why men are the way that they are, instead of the creator God who created men and women in his image. So this is pervasive. It's pervasive as a story. The first problem that I'd like to point out is just kind of the a priori absurdity of the idea. When you look at, I can't remember who said this, but I think it might have been Douglas Wilson. He put up a picture of some kind of exotic fish that really exists out there in the world. And it's got like rainbow colors all over it. It's polka dot. It's got oranges and reds and purples and pinks and blues and greens. And it's got this elaborate series of spikes all over its body, and then these huge whiskers that come out, and it's this weird kind of oblong football shape. And, there's some other ridiculous things about it. Like, I don't know, part of it glows in the dark or something. And you look at that, and there's this thing out there that is one of the most magnificent pieces of art, and it's a fish, right? And not only is it magnificent to look at and behold, and you go look at the intricacy and the beauty of this thing, it replicates itself. It replicates itself. It would be like if Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh could replicate itself, could mate with other paintings and produce beautiful works of art oil on the canvas. And that's actually a ridiculous comparison because the painting is far less complex than the fish. And this is just a fish. And we probably didn't even know about this fish until we could scuba dive, right? Most people, and so there's this fish that's just out there in the ocean somewhere that God just created for his own pleasure. He knows, and there are aspects of creation like all over in distant nebulae that we will never see. Beauties and glories and magnificent works of art, across the scale of light years, massive, that we'll never see, that just exist because God is creative and, they delight him. And then someone comes along and they have the audacity to say, well, the story of how this fish came to be, you'd look at it, you'd think maybe that it was designed. But hang on. Actually, it wasn't. Actually, there was a rock, and the rock got together with some water in this kind of muddy, salty solution, and then some sunlight came in and infused energy into the system, and, pretty soon this fish kind of came out, a couple billion years. But, then this fish came to be. And any of our children, if we told them that story, they'd be like, Daddy. They do this to me all the time because I lie to them for my own entertainment. I tell them ridiculous things, that you wouldn't believe it, but there are unicorns that live in the woods back there, and they hear this story and they say, Daddy, are you telling the truth right now? Our kids could see right through it. They'd look at it and they would say, wow, that is crazy. And the evolutionary naturalist, he appeals to his PhDs and he says, well, you're just expressing your anthropomorphism, and your anthropocentrism, where, you infer design wherever there's not really design, just because human beings design things that happen to look this way. So, you're really just not intellectual enough. And you should just say, what? I'm not intellectual. You're the one saying that the rock got together with the water and the sun and the mud and this fish came out. You're the one telling that story. There's an a priori absurdity to this idea. And actually, contrary to modern opinion, this story has gotten more and more elaborately absurd the more we've come to know about the world we live in. I mean, you could at least maybe give the ancients cut them some slack to think that life could have crawled out of some primordial ooze, because to them, maybe they thought life wasn't really that big of a deal. Maybe they thought it wasn't that complicated. Even in the 1600s, the Enlightenment period, as they were beginning to first come to some of these ideas about abiogenesis, that life comes from non-life through merely natural processes. The reason that they were able, at least, to justify these theories is because they thought life was a fairly simple affair. They thought it was essentially some kind of, little goo that was just pretty small, and it could come to self-replicate, and it really wasn't that big of a deal. And now we look at life, the simplest forms of life are astonishingly complex. The simplest forms of life are more complex than anything anybody in the engineering department at Northrop Grumman has ever come up with in their wildest fever dreams. We're talking about molecular machinery built of interlocking, multiply independent parts, none of which, if you're missing any of them, the whole thing doesn't work at all. You can't stair-step your way up to it with, you can't it'd be like trying to stair-step your way up to a Corvette engine by just adding a few parts along the way. The problem is, take away even one essential component and the engine doesn't work at all. It's just a big paperweight. That's essentially what is going on, even at the most simple, quote-unquote, forms of life. Michael Behe, he popularized this idea of irreducible complexity. That's essentially this idea that things like the blood clotting cascade, the sight, the eye, and the way that it interacts with the nervous system. Many things inside of living systems are irreducibly complex. The flagellar motor is an example that's often given in simple bacterial cells. We have a motor that's like an outboard motor. If you've ever seen an outboard motor on a boat, it's like that, except it's microscopic and lives within a cell, and it turns at like 30,000 RPMs, this little motor, and it's made of 30 or 40 interlocking parts. The whole thing doesn't work unless all of them are present and in their proper state. And each of those parts are built of proteins that have to be constructed on the basis of information stored on a sugar's phosphate spine of deoxyribonucleic acid that essentially stores a computer machine code that tells the cell how to make the protein, to then make the part, to then make the motor, to then make the cell. And people are trying to tell your 8-year-old in school that happened from some magic. From some evolutionary magic. Well, there's a priori absurdity problem that even if you just have eyes and you look at the world, and the more you have eyes, the more you look, the more the story sounds absurd. The more the story just, it doesn't strike you as plausible. We have the grist problem as well. Often if you talk to an evolutionary naturalist, if you're in school and you challenge your AP biology teacher, she will hypothetically, not that I experienced this or anything in the 11th grade at Northridge High, they will often appeal to things like, well, it's very simple and observable. It's science. It's natural selection. We can go observe this, and then we'll talk about some finches in the Galapagos and some differing lengths of beaks and things like that. Like, see, it's natural. We can observe it's natural selection. They'll tell you the story, and they'll tell you part of the story that you can actually go out and see, and you're like, yeah, okay, I can see that. That's plausible. Well, here's the problem. Natural selection doesn't really do much for you if you're an evolutionary naturalist, because natural selection, as the saying goes, can only explain the survival of the fittest, not the arrival of the fittest. It has to work on existing stuff. Natural selection is like a mill that could grind wheat into flour. If you have flour, you still have to explain where the wheat came from. You have to explain where that came from. Natural selection can only operate on existing structures. For example, the story goes, here's an organism, and as it's reproducing, one of its offspring happens to have this kind of adaptation that's just, a genetic mutation or whatever, and it happens to flop out some random other limb. And then, that happens to give it some survival advantage, and so natural selection takes on, and then it's able to reproduce more easily or more readily than its competitors, and so eventually that organism and its will eventually have whatever adaptation it happened to have. Well, that's all well and good, except we actually have virtually no way of explaining how those adaptations happen in the first place. And people will say, no, that's not true. I remember my biology textbook. It's genetic mutation. Gotcha. You say genetic mutation. Right, it's genetic mutation that did that. Okay, so what you're saying is that slowly we compiled, just from random interchanges within that machine code in the DNA, we had some, different adaptations that happened to be advantageous. Well, that's a very good story. I can tell that story quite plausibly. I can line up a series of, illustrations to show how the whale became the land mammal, or, vice versa. I honestly can't remember which direction they made up that goes. Whether the land mammal becomes the whale or the whale becomes the land mammal. One of those two things is how they lie about it. But I could do some illustrations and line them up and be like, see, this is how it could have happened. Well, problem, genetic mutation doesn't actually do that. It doesn't do that. Well, sure, within this machine code, it seems like there's a variety of expressions within a fixed boundary that can take, like a beak getting slightly longer or shorter. Absolutely, that's observable. That's called science. We can observe it. We can go look at it and say, yeah, that happens. But as we continue to observe, we find this interesting phenomena, and that is that genetic mutation essentially does not produce what they're saying it will. What it actually produces is death more often than anything else. Death more often than anything else. This is actually what you might call the combinatorial problem within the adaptation argument. New complexity in the combinatorial problem. See, the way that living systems, to the best of our knowledge right now, produce your body plan is, again, that they follow this information, we're going to get to this in a moment, within the cell, stored in the DNA, and increasingly we find that it's actually also stored in systems outside or above the DNA that turns on and off various portions of the DNA at advantageous moments. It's tremendously complex. The more we learn about it, the more complex it gets. What we find is that in order to develop the new proteins, think of them like building blocks, the 2x4s and sheetrock, and materials out of which you'd build the house. That's what the proteins are in living systems. You're made out of proteins. In order to make these new proteins, to make these new structures, you have to arrive at these very, 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 it's hard for me to explain how specific combinations of machine code in the DNA that will tell you how to make one protein. This protein has to come together. If you were to look at a rendering of a protein, it's crazy looking. It has to not only be organized in the correct way, it has to be able to fold in this very specific way, or it doesn't work at all. There are more ways to not make a protein, even if you were to put all the ingredients inside of a dish and stir it around. There are more ways to not make a protein than there are atoms in the entire universe in comparison to the correct ways to make a protein. And what this story of evolutionary naturalism says is that, well, yeah, I mean, there was some rearranging and some cutting and pasting that happened by accident inside of this molecule, and it came up with some new proteins. You're like, oh, really? And John McClane surfed on an F-22, and that happened as well. I've seen Die Hard 4. You're like, well, I've heard of CGI as well. This is the Origins equivalent of CGI. They're just making it up, putting together some pretty illustrations and textbooks, and then on the basis of the vaunted authority of their PhD saying, this is how the story unfolded. This is how it happened. And you're not allowed to question it. But more and more, the open problem and the open, the open secret within biology is that we have no mechanism that's even close to plausible to explain how even one new protein to make these new systems came to exist. We have no idea. We have no idea. There's the combinatorial problem of making new proteins to make new structures. We actually even have a worse problem than that, and because that problem at least starts with some DNA and says, well, pokes it with a stick and says, okay, DNA, do something. Make a mistake and come up with some new structure or protein fold. Well, it doesn't do that. But the even bigger problem is how we got the first DNA in the first place, or RNA, or whatever you want to say. How do we get these immensely complex biological molecules that basically function like machine code? How did we get these in the first place? Because that's what's happening inside every cell in your body. And you probably know this, but this is crazy that we were able to figure this out, actually. It shows that we were made in the image of God and that God hid, glories in the world for us to discover, the glory of kings to discover and search out the mysteries that God has hidden in the world. It wasn't until 1953 when two, and these guys, if you read this story, it's crazy. They were like bumbling nobodies that everybody thought were crazy. They weren't a part of the prestigious labs that were trying to solve this problem of how essentially within the living cell this molecule might be structured to hold this machine code that people suspected existed. We didn't know how it was formed. People said, well, maybe it's like a triple helix, maybe it's like all these different, they came up with some fanciful models. And Watson and Crick, James Watson and Francis Crick, they solved this problem essentially with like duct tape and stolen research from other labs that weren't able to put it together. And they were like, well, maybe it's this. And everyone was like, it couldn't be that. And then they look closer and they're like, oh my goodness, it's that. These guys figured it out. It wasn't until 1953 that we even knew this, that DNA was a double helix of nucleotide bases, which is essentially like, you've seen the illustrations by now, all of us have this swirling, it's like a big spine of sugar phosphate nucleotide bases that are just little chemical units linked together and then folded up in this specific way or spiraled together in this very specific way. And what you discover about this molecule is that it is essentially computer code, but better. And pretty much everybody agrees with this. Richard Dawkins said this. He said, the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. Bill Gates, who is, obviously knows a thing or two about software, agreed. He said, DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. Once we discover that this is what is at the bottom, at least to our knowledge so far, of living cells and the way that they replicate themselves, essentially following this machine code like a software program that tells hardware what to do. This is like that, except if your computer could replicate itself over and over millions of times every minute. Like if your MacBook could be left in the room and then you come back and there are 18,000 more MacBooks, it would be like that, right? That's what DNA is and does, to vastly oversimplify it. The problem is, despite many attempts to think otherwise, Biologists basically have to admit right now that DNA molecules store vastly complicated, highly precise language that conveys specified complexity, meaning that it's not mere noise. I mean, any random string of numbers contains what we could call Shannon information that is just, it's very complex, and it'd be very unlikely for you to land at any particular combination of 6,000 rolls of the dice in a row. It's a lot of information in that string of dice rolls. But this isn't just complicated like that. It's complicated like a Shakespeare sonnet, right? Of course, it's equally unlikely that you would combine the same number of letters in a row in any given sequence. But on top of that, you add the fact that Shakespeare's sonnet, this string of letters communicates something according to some fixed rules that apparently exist by no necessity. There's no necessity inside of the alphabet that makes it land in Shakespeare sonnets if you were to shake up a bag of Scrabble tiles and then pour them out on the ground. Biologists for 60 years have been trying to figure out how to pretend like this could have come about without any information from an intelligent source, and they've basically come up with lots of nonsensical things that eventually proved to be ridiculous. You could look just for one example at a book called Biochemical Predestination by Dr. Kenyon. It was published in 1969. It was like the gospel for 20 years in this world until Dr. Kenyon basically said, it's all garbage, none of it works, based on my new research. And his idea was that it was predestined, that these nucleotide bases, there was some kind of law, just like sugars will form crystals in certain environments that look highly ordered. Well, maybe DNA is like that. It's like a crystal that has to form in this particular way. Turns out that's absurd and nonsense, and it actually doesn't work at all in that way. Here's the open secret. None of the other theories work. None of them. Not one. Go and get a PhD in evolutionary biology from the most prestigious university in the world, and guess what they will not have? An answer to that problem. Guess what they will not have? Even anything resembling an answer to that problem. They have no idea. No idea. This is really the fundamental problem with evolutionary naturalism. This story that people have been telling our kindergartners through our higher education that's been dissolving people's faith, this story of the world that's actually laughable, is that essentially they've written methodological rules into the beginning of the investigation that rule out the possibility of a non-ridiculous solution. Let me explain that sentence because it was kind of convoluted. They're approaching the question of how did this ridiculous fish come to exist? And the first rule that they've written in how they can answer this question is, we cannot appeal to anything intelligent. We cannot appeal to anything outside of naturalistic processes. That's rule number one. However we answer the question of how this fish came to be, we cannot say this thing. We're not allowed. Why? Well, because that's not science. It's not scientific. What if the answer is that thing? Then you have just ruled out definitionally the possibility of coming to a non-ridiculous solution. Let me give you an illustration. You're an archaeologist, you're in the ancient Mediterranean, and you find a clay pot, and inside the clay pot, there is a papyrus. And inside of this papyrus, as you unroll it, there is a string of characters written in some kind of black substance. And you begin to study this papyrus, and you come to every nuance of it. You've dated it. You've looked at the materials it was made from, the ink. You've looked at the handwriting. You believe that you can isolate the exact period of history where this was written because of this particular Roman character and this particular ink and this particular location and the way the clay pot was made. And you write your paper and you peer review it and you present it, and people laugh at you and they say, that's absurd. Don't you know that papyruses aren't the result of intelligence? And you would back up and you'd say, what? Of course it's the result. Look, it's language. It's written in letters there. Are you an idiot? Are you are you an ignoramus? Did you hit your head on the way in? Of course. And they say, no, we know how papyruses form. Some rushes from the Nile River, the Nile changed its course, and so those rushes dried out and they become kind of very brittle. And then an earthquake rolled some big stones through and it crushed it to powder. All right, then it rained and that powder was reconstituted as a kind of papery planty goo. And then they got flattened between two rocks, and then those rocks by another earthquake, flung apart, and then wind blew, and that, then sheet of papyrus, as you call it, blew off in the wind. And then it happened to land on this other rock where some charcoal from a lightning strike fire had reconstituted with some other water and turned into a kind of inky substance. And then there was this rock that, because of the actions of wind and erosion, it formed something that looks to your puny brain like letters. And then that papyrus fell on it, and another rock fell on it, and then fell off, and then it blew off. And then let me tell you how the clay pot formed. And they developed this elaborate scenario where the papyrus rolled itself up and then was found in this pot by the intrepid investigator 1,800 years later. And the only answer that you could possibly give as the archaeologist to this is to shake your head and laugh and kind of walk away. You can't reason with these people. You just can't reason with them because it's absurd. From the beginning, they have ruled out the possibility of the correct answer. And so, of course, the only thing they can come to are absurd conclusions. By the way, the illustration that I just gave you is far more plausible than that fish. Far more plausible than that fish. By about 1 trillion-fold. I mean, I couldn't even explain to you how much more plausible the story I just told is than even one, salmonella organism existing in the world. It's absolutely, utterly absurd. So just to throw out some failed hypotheses. Well, it's so absurd, right? This combinatorial problem, this randomness just can't seem to produce this kind of specified complexity to make even one protein fold. In fact, Stephen Meyer, who I don't even agree with the guy. I'm a young earther, by the way. He's an old earther. But I think his books provide a useful internal critique of evolution. He's written Signature in the Cell, Darwin's Doubt, The Return of the God Hypothesis, a bunch of books. One thing he demonstrates is that he's a philosopher of science, very, very sharp guy. He demonstrates that the combinatorial resources of the entire universe are not sufficient to produce even one novel protein fold, one. And you need many to make a living organism. Okay. What he means by that is that if you calculate out, to the best of our understanding, which is probably way off, how many particles there are in all of existence, it's something like 1 × 10 to the 83rd power particles in all of existence. Well, you would need, in order to just randomly, if you put all the nucleotide bases together to make one protein fold, you would need something like 1 chance in 1 × 10 to the 127th power to make one. Right? That's how, and these numbers, we can't even comprehend these numbers. These numbers are vast beyond our understanding. To illustrate, I think a million minutes is like 32 years. A billion minutes is like 33,000 years. So the difference between a million and a billion, when you multiply it again by 1,000, is it becomes just meaningless to us. And we're talking about a 1 with 127 zeros after it. We just can't comprehend these kind of odds. Even if you grant them half of their absurd story, this long age is needed for the process to work at all, or so they say, it still doesn't work. So what they did is they invented a new scenario wherein they could have infinite number of universes, because they see that our universe isn't enough to make this chance thing work. So they invented these, you might call them exotic naturalism, which are basically religion, multiverse scenarios that in the popular media, you'll read articles all the time that will be like, multiverse scenario, and they act like they're totally plausible. Multiverse scenarios are absurd. They're absolutely absurd. They make no sense mathematically. You have to add ad hoc presupposition on top of ad hoc presupposition to get them to kind of work. I mean, physicists have wasted like 40 years trying to invent this magical inflaton field that would essentially make multi-universes pop out in the initial expansionary state of the origins of the universe according to their models. And then they find out like, well, this just doesn't work. Okay, scratch that, throw it away. They have to come up with an infinite number of universes, and then they run into philosophical problems. And if you don't understand everything I'm saying right now, it's fine. But they run into philosophical problems like it is far more likely that a universe would pop into existence in which there was a single disembodied mind than a universe like ours that had all of this massive complexity. It's far more likely for you just to have a random universe pop up with a disembodied brain, they call it a Boltzmann brain problem, than it is to come up with a universe like ours. So even their absurd solutions that don't work end up being absurd. Why? Because they're trying to explain the papyrus by saying a human couldn't have written it. That's the fundamental reason. They're trying to suppress the knowledge of what? Of the Creator that every molecule of existence preaches. All of creation is saying to you, I was created. I was designed. Not even the fish. Quartz is saying I was designed. Physical reality is saying I was designed. Stars are saying I was designed. Hydrogen was saying I was designed. And of course, hippopotamuses and people are saying I was designed. Only absurd fools would attempt to convince you that all of this is random atoms running into each other given enough time. It's absolutely ridiculous. So here's how we ought to respond. Number one, we should laugh at it. And the reason I say this is not to be rude, but because they really hate it. The thing that academics hate, academics, is that a word? Academics. The thing that academics hate more than anything is not to be taken seriously. And so, and the thing they hate even more than that is not to be taken seriously by people without degrees. Because you couldn't possibly understand the complexities I'm working with. I went to school for 4 years. I'd be like, oh, 4 years, look at this guy. 4 years. I just show him a picture of that fish, and I'm like, explain this with your 4 years, Bubba. Come up with an explanation for this. Have you heard of the combinatorial problem with bioorigins? No? Okay, moving on. Laugh at them because they hate it so much. Because the way that the emperor's magical, invisible clothing continued to be put forth as a theory is only because people pretend to be stupider than they are. And so the first thing you ought to do is just say, a second grader has enough common sense to say that the story you just told about the world we live in is absurd. It doesn't work. I'm sorry, the second grader could come up with a better story than what you just came up with. Right? So we need to laugh at it. And it's important that we laugh at it for not just to make them annoyed, but also because laughing at absurd things that are, absurd arguments that are lifted up against the knowledge of God, it inoculates the people around us to being deceived by empty philosophy and human deceit, right? Which is what Paul warns us against in Colossians. Human tradition, human philosophy, empty deceit, the elemental principles of the world. It's important that we protect our children and those around us from being sucked into these, because they're pure genetic fallacies. They're pure appeals to authority. At the bottom, that's all they are. I have the authority. I'm a scientist, TM. I'm a scientist. You have to trust me. And they'll suck people in. I mean, they're sucking millions of people into this absurd story. When we learn to laugh at it as a whole community, it inoculates the community against getting sucked into it. They begin to see through the wordiness and see through all of the piling up of complex jargon that takes place. And you say, well, boiling it down, what you're saying is that the papyrus I found in the clay pot was made by the stone rolling through the feet. And that's what you're saying fundamentally. There's a lot of jargon built up. Oh, well, that's pretty stupid, now that I think about it. Laughing at it inoculates the community. We ought also to make them be consistent with them, with their story, or at least show them the impossibility of being consistent with their story. You can say something like, okay, if what you just said is true, if the story you just told me about the nature of life and the world is true, then blank follows with cold and inescapable necessity. Things like, well, then you're saying that you and I are highly evolved primates. Yes, that's what I'm saying. Okay, highly evolved primates. Are they allowed to steal from each other or not? Well, I suppose that primates, do occasionally steal bananas and mates from other people. I suppose that's a natural part of the community life of the. Okay, that's fine. So they're allowed to steal from each other. Is it wrong for a monkey to steal from another monkey? Well, I suppose using a word like wrong to describe the intricacies of the culture of the primates would be kind of absurd. And then take his keys and run right then. Just take his keys and run and be like. Highly evolved primates, man. And of course he's gonna be like, wait, stop, that's wrong. Oh, wait, shoot. Nobody lives like this story is true. Because obviously if this story is true, then meaning is illusory, morality is illusory, truth is illusory, and actually even human willing is illusory and deterministic. There are elaborate philosophical ways to try and get around this, but essentially if all you're saying there is atoms running into each other, then what you're saying is that the world is just a very complicated billiard table and that some initial energy got all the balls moving. And if you were smart enough, if you were a computer that had perfect physical laws programmed into you, and you knew all of the initial vectoring of, like, say, the cue ball into the pool balls on a billiard table, you could precisely predict exactly where every pool ball will land after you hit the cue ball into all the other balls. Well, your thoughts are just billiard balls on a really much more complicated pool table, if that's true. Meaning that your thoughts, right now, the movement of the atoms in your brain that are resulting in what you think of as thoughts that are not really they're just frothing of chemicals, those were all determined from the beginning when the cue ball went into the system, man. So even thoughts like evolutionary naturalism is true and describes reality are meaningless because they were already determined by the initial input of the system. It makes human willing an illusion. It makes meaning an illusion. It makes all of your thoughts an illusion. All they are chemical frothing. You should have no confidence whatsoever in the truth or falsity of your own thoughts, including the truth or falsity of your own thoughts about evolution itself. Because it's just impossible, definitionally from the beginning. So you have to make them be consistent with their own story, or at least show them that they are not consistent with their own story. They act like there's such thing as truth and meaning and that it's important and that they should search it out. And they'll make all sorts of arguments from utility, and they'll say, well, of course it's better to live as if there's truth because, look, I feel better, and human feelings are apparently important for some reason. I don't know why, but I think they are, and so they are. It's all just brute force saying things are true, but you can never say that anything else is false. It's just meaningless. It's just the collision of atoms. So it's important that we do that, and you can do things like making them account for the preconditions of intelligibility, things like the preconditions that must be true for them to do science in the first place, like their senses being reliable. You've heard me say this before. Like the past being like the future, like the laws that govern our bubble of existence being the laws that govern every part of existence, which, by the way, we can't prove even at all. Like, is the speed of light the same here on Earth as it is on Jupiter? We actually couldn't prove that right now. Maybe someday we could. We could put a meter up on Jupiter and figure that out. But could we do that for a galaxy 100 light years away? No way. Couldn't do it. How much of the universe, the physical reality, have we sampled? If the universe is a big bag of marbles, and inside of this bag there are 1 times 10 to the 83rd power marbles, and let's say that out of those marbles, all of them are red except for one. Well, what if we happen to live on the one non-red marble, and we've just concluded that all marbles are not red? We don't know that. We don't know that's not true. We don't know what the laws of physics are 100 light years from our little rock. We have no idea. Well, we have math that works, and we've explained what we observe, but that's just 0.000000000000000, add a bunch more zeros, 1% of all of the data that we could sample. Would you say you've come to a reliable conclusion if you do a study where you sample 0.000000001% of people? No, of course not. We can't prove any of the preconditions of intelligibility without question. And I'm not trying to lead you to radical skepticism. I'm trying to lead you to the conclusion that your senses are reliable and that basically you can look at the world and come to correct conclusions about it because you were created by an intelligent mind. So make them be consistent, make them account for these preconditions. And then really the most important part, as you're chuckling at this story, is to pat them on the head. No, not really. Don't really be ultra patronizing to people. That's actually not effective as evangelism. But it's okay, believe it or not. I know, it really convinces me when people are really patronizing to me. No, I'm not saying that. I'm actually saying we should be kind and loving to our neighbors who are trapped in this lie. But one of the ways to do this is to kind of chuckle at it and be like, wait, so you believe this? And then kind of restate it, and not a patronizing jerk kind of way, but just being honest. And it's important that we give them hope, to live like their story is stupid and ours is true. We ought to live like their story is stupid because it is stupid. But we should also, on the other side, live like our story is true. We should live like our story is true. We should live as those with hope. We should live as if there's great meaning in the world and our lives have meaning. We should live as if there's truth and it matters deeply. We should live as if there is such thing as evil, and there is such thing as good, and there is such thing as beauty, and there is such thing as a modern art, ugliness, and there is such thing as, we should live as if our story is true. Because one of the most powerful apologetics is to live as a people with hope, because their story can't give them hope. Their story can only give them blind despair. And so when Peter says, be ready to give an account for the hope that is within you, an apologia, a defense, a reasoned defense for the hope that's within you, he's assuming that you're living as if you have hope. And the reason this is so powerful, it's true whether you believe that the false story of pagan mythology is true, which leaves you blind, meaningless, pitiless indifference and no hope, like ancient Romans or Stoics or modern atheistic naturalists who are really just rearranged pagans worshiping the creature, worshiping creation instead of the creator. If we live as if our story is true and theirs is stupid, then eventually we'll have somebody ask us, why? It's compelling. It's compelling, for example, when massive percentages of the world around us live increasingly vapid lives leading to crippling despair, for Christians to be cheerful, simply to be cheerful. Why would you be cheerful if your great-grandfather was a fish and the end of the universe is heat death? Why would you be cheerful? Cheerfulness is just dopamine, man. It's just more chemicals. Why would I be cheerful? Who cares? Live as if your story is true. Be cheerful. Be cheerful. Paul says that we actually do have the power to tear down every argument and lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God. He says that to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 10, 3-5. Go read that passage. You have that. You have that. How? By living as if the Christian story is true, because it is. By being a repentant, humble, loving, patient, kind people, clothed in the fruits of the Spirit, producing fruit, going through life with joy and hope and expectation of good things in the future, because you have a good Father in heaven. Of course I'm expecting good things in the future. Whether I suffer or abound, I'm expecting good things because I have a Father in heaven. They don't have a Father in heaven. They have a coelacanth. They have an ancient fish in the oceans. They don't have a Father in heaven. They've got no hope. So as we live with hope and live like their story is not true because it's not, then we can be powerfully salty and bright in our communities. We've got about 5 minutes, so if we probably have time for maybe one question or follow-up. Sorry to start late today. Pastor Dan, do you have a question? You could just yell it out and I'll repeat it if you want.
Okay.
For time.
So strategically thinking,
Mm-hmm.
big picture, is there one thing that you can think of, one principle or one action that the Christian church today could do that would change everything? Because these classes that you're giving see now common themes that the battle of our time is anthropology.
Yeah.
Even it seems like that's constantly what the enemy is trying to do, is dehumanize image bearers. So is there one thing in our cultural moment that the Big C church could do to combat this?
Yeah, is there one, Dan's asking for the recording, is there one big thing, since the theme through this class seems to be anthropology, what is a person, that the Christian church can do that would make a difference? Like one practical, big, strategic thing, and I think it's obvious that the answer is education. I think it's obvious that the answer is education. Educating our children. Because what we're doing right now is we're sending our children, and I'm not talking about us, I'm talking about the wider church, generally not just does this, but defends it as actually a good thing because our children are missionaries, sending them to public schools where they're being taught essentially from often now even preschool. We're starting schooling increasingly younger and going longer with our schooling. So sometimes we're talking about like 20 years of education by the time they're done. They're being taught this story. Of course they're not going to believe in biblical gender roles. That's like fruit way out here on the branch. They believe people are, their great-grandfather was a fish. Biblical gender roles are pretty far downstream from that. So we have to disciple our children and remember that education is a sub-discipline of discipleship. So we need to stop sending our children to pagans to be discipled, and even well-meaning pagans who are very kind and actually take their job very seriously and want to educate children well and love them. But legally, by definition, from the foundation, they are required to tell this story in everything, not just in biology, but in chemistry, chemical evolution, in astronomy and physics, stellar evolution, in astronomical evolution, in you name it, in social studies, in history, and go through the line. So the most important thing that we can do is actually disciple our people so that they're ready to give a defense and they actually don't believe these things about the nature of reality, because they're inconsistent. They cannot coexist. And more broadly, I would say we just need to insist on loving people relentlessly, because they not only do they not know what a person is, but they obviously don't love people. You can't love a person properly if you think that that's what they are, and so they don't. Human life is very cheap, because if their story is true, human life is very cheap. And so they act like human life is very cheap, and we can't do that. We can't do that medically. We can't do that as we relate to our aging parents or our children. We can't do that as we relate to our neighbors. Christians have, no matter what was going on in the world, Christians have generally been known as people who radically love other people. That's been, our thing, because Jesus said it would be, our love for one another and our love for our neighbor. So we should be those who are adopting. We should be those who are, going and not fearing diseases in order to love our neighbors. And we could go down the line. Gil, last question, and we'll call it. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, okay. It's a good question. So what about theistic evolution, where, this theory that essentially at key points, like let's say Stephen Meyer, let's say at the Cambrian explosion, where all of a sudden something like 20 out of 27 body plans in the biosphere come into being in the fossil record according to their story overnight. We have no explanation for this radical expansion of biological information in the cell, in the body plans that resulted, the protein folds, all of this different stuff. So that's when God injected some information into the system. It's just theistic evolution, man. And I would say that would be like explaining the papyrus found in the pot with all of the same story, except just saying, and then God blew the wind, and then God sent the earthquake, and then God smashed the paper between the rocks, and then God, and it just seems to me like it's very ad hoc. And it's like trying to make a failed hypothesis work by increasingly adding ad hoc elements to it over and over. And so, that's basically, very, very short story, what I think about theistic evolution. But even more primally, like underneath that, I think theistic evolution is inconsistent with the text. So I have a problem with the theological implications of theistic evolution, like there being no literal Adam. There was a primate community. You could read William Lane Craig if you want to harm yourself and experience pain. You could go read his stuff on this. It's death before the fall, all of that. My basic response to that is to say that if God says that he made a star, that he made a star, and he did not make hydrogen gas that swirled over billions of years in the process of stellar evolution, following the laws of physics that eventually formed a star in a spiral arm galaxy. And he formed a tree, he made a tree, and you might have done a core sample of the tree and said, this tree is 47 years old, but it would have been a tree that was actually like 8 minutes old. I've got no problem with that. So, yeah, and there are all kinds of reactions that a theistic evolutionist would have to everything I just said, and they'd be like, but, and then we'd have a long conversation. But we're out of time, so thank you.